Good morning to you. It's Thursday morning and welcome to Penn Vicarage. And thank you, as always, for joining us for our Bible talk for today as we continue our adventure through the amazing book of Psalms, which is the Old Testament hymn book. There's 150 of them and they're absolutely brilliant. Today we're looking at Psalm 2. I have to say, on a personal note, this psalm always reminds me of my father-in-law because he's always singing it. And there's a quote from it which is sung in Handel's Messiah, and he's always singing it all the time. So this psalm always reminds me of him. Anyway, Psalm 2, here goes. Beginning to end, here goes. Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury. I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, with trembling kiss his feet, or he will be angry, and you will perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Happy are all who take refuge in him. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, my friends, as I say, we're in Psalm 2 this morning. And interesting if you're watching yesterday, Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 actually come very well together. And you can tell this because Psalm 1 begins with a beatitude and Psalm 2 ends with one. So Psalm 1 begins with, happy are those who follow the advice, who do not follow the advice of the wicked. Psalm 2 ends with, happy are all who take refuge in him. So the 1 and 2 gets you might bookended, if you like, by a thing about happiness, of what they call a beatitude. There are other similarities as well. Both of them talk about meditation, but in the first one, he talks about those who meditate on the Lord day and night, and in Psalm 2, he talks about those who plot together. And the word meditate and the word plot are apparently the same Hebrew word. So again, Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 are very much a pair. Also, what you might not know is the Psalms are split together into what they call five books of Psalms. And book 1 is Psalm 1 to Psalm 41. So these two books, Psalm 1 and 2, are obviously at the beginning of book 1. And what's interesting here is that the vast majority of the Psalms in book 1 have got some kind of a title. So if you look at Psalm 3, for example, it has a title that says, a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. And the vast majority of the psalms in book 1 have got a title, but Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 don't. So the point I'm making is that Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 very much come together. The context of Psalm 2, it's very much apparently was set in the context of things like coronations, as you can imagine, a king being crowned. And maybe it's relevant for us at the moment. But here, God's Davidic king, God's David-like king, if you like, is being crowned. And so the context in which Psalm 2 is often used was kind of coronations, that sort of stuff, the enthroning of a king and that sort of stuff, and kingly events. So it was very much the context it was used, generally speaking, was kind of either coronations or kingly events, that kind of sort of royal stuff, if you like. So as I say, but relevant for us, our lives at the moment. Psalm 2 fits neatly into kind of 4 sections. There are 12 verses. There's 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 9, and 10 to 12. The first 3 verses, all sort of poetry, see? The first 3 verses talk about some sort of what they call vassal nations, these nations who conspire against the Lord. That's the first 3, the first one. So the verses 1 to 3 are all about, kings of the earth rising up against God, let us bursting their bonds asunder and trying to break free from the shackles of God, if you like. That's verses 1 to 3. Verses 4 to 6 is God's response, which is basically to kind of laugh them to scorn. You think so, do you? I mean, it's very much, God is very much, in verse 4 to 6, he's kind of laughing them to scorn. Verses 7 to 9, you have a kind of enthronement of God's king, God's Davidic king being enthroned there. And verses 10 to 12 is kind of a warning and a bit of advice for the rest of us, turn to God and make God your refuge. So there's 4 sections. 1 to 3 is about vassal nations wanting to sort of be rebel against God. Verses 4 to 6 is God's response, which is kind of, to say, to laugh them to scorn. Oh, you think so, do you? Verses 7 to 9 is the kind of enthronement of God's king on earth, and verse 10 to 12 is the warning to the rest of us, basically to turn to God and to live life God's way. So that's what's going on. So you've got Psalms 1 and 2 being very much together. They've got words in common. They're bookended by the Beatitude, and they both use words about, one talks about meditation, one talks about conspiring, but it's the same word being used. So there's lots of similarities between Psalms 1 and Psalm 2. And you've got Psalm 2 here being being neatly combined into 4 sections throughout the psalm. So that's a bit about the kind of general overall thrust and the context of what's going on in Psalm 2. I suppose for us, I want us to gain sort of 3 things from this morning. Firstly, this. We tend to think of faith as being an individual thing. But what this tells us is it's rather bigger than that. That God is not just king of individuals' lives, God is king of the earth too. And God is king of the nations too. And that God has complete sovereignty over the world. God knows what he's doing. Now, Psalm 1 is all about individuals, the important thing of individuals taking refuge in God and meditating on God and that type of thing. Psalm 2 is very much about nations. So it tells us here very strongly that God is sovereign, that God is not just, that the Christian faith and the faith in God is not just something that individuals to do. It's actually something God is involved in international things as well. That God is king of the world, not just of my life. That Jesus is Lord and that God is king, and that God is sovereign. And as I say, Psalm 1 tends to focus on us as individuals, but Psalm 2, get the picture here about the sovereignty of God through the nations as well. And this can be reassuring, actually, because, sometimes international politics can just seem crazy and we wonder what's going on and, has God given up, or have people given up on God? And I don't know. But what Psalm 2 tells us is that God is sovereign and that people can try and break free of the bonds of God if that's what they want. But he in heaven, who's bigger than all of them, who created them in the first place, kind of lasts them to scorn. So see here the sovereignty of God in nations and not just as individuals. The second thing it tells us is the importance of living for God. And in verse 1, he talks about the importance of meditating on the word of God. And that in our lives, individuals, we need to meditate on God. But in Psalm 2, it's about nations doing the same thing. And he talks about happy is the one who takes refuge in the Lord. And that we can, whoever we are, we can take refuge in God. That God is our stronghold. That God is somebody in whom we can take refuge. Where do you go if you're out in the rain and it starts to rain? You take refuge somewhere. Where do you go in times of danger? You take refuge. You find a place of safety. You find a place of refuge. And so Psalm 1 talks about, as individuals, meditating on the law of God. Psalm 2 talks about taking refuge in him. Either way, the important thing is turning to him. Turning to him in scripture, turning to him as our refuge, on the one in whom we can be safe. So the first lesson we learn from this is about God is sovereign of everything, nations as well as individuals. But secondly, the importance of living for God, meditating on his word and turning to him for safety. But with these Psalms, I want to always kind of refer them to Jesus. And there is a bit section here which is quoted in the Gospels. You are my son, today I have begotten you. And of course, that's what's quoted by God himself in the New Testament. At the baptism of Jesus came out of the waters of baptism, and God, this God said from heaven, this is my son, my beloved, listen to him. And likewise, and that rather strange incident we call the Transfiguration, just shortly before Jesus went into Jerusalem, when he kind of glows and Moses on one side and Elijah on the other. Again, this voice comes from heaven for the disciples, and it says, "This is my son, my beloved. Listen to him." And it's a quote here from Psalm 2, which says, where God says about his king in the Old Testament, "This is my son, today I have begotten you." The same God in the New Testament says, "This is my son, my beloved. Listen to him," quoting Psalm 2. So lots to get stuck into there. Do feel free to read it again and enjoy the Psalms. 2 down, 148 to go. God bless you,